Thank you so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here to speak to all of you today. As mentioned by our lovely MC, I am the creative director of PUSAKA, and PUSAKA is an organization that works very closely with traditional performing arts in Malaysia. We work basically to support the viability of the traditional performing arts. We work closely with communities throughout Malaysia. The peninsula Malaysia, from Kelantan to Johor and all the way to Penang. I'm going to speak to you today about mainly three traditions: the Makyong tradition of Kelantan, the Wayang Kulit tradition also of Kelantan, and the Kuda Kepang tradition of Johor. But I'm also going to talk to you mainly about the way in which young people of these communities are involved in not just preserving and safeguarding their traditions, but also transforming their traditions and making them relevant for today. Now, I wonder how many of you even have seen any of these performing arts, if you've ever seen a Makyong, if you've ever seen a Wayang Kulit or Kuda Kepang tradition. And I wonder how many of you have even know some of the stories that are involved. If you've ever heard, for example, of the story of Dewa Muda. Dewa Muda, who is a young demigod prince, who once saw in a dream a face of a beautiful princess, Tuan Putri Ratna Mas, and was told by an old sage in his dream that if he wants to meet this princess, he must go in search of a golden deer in a clearing of a forest. And so the young demigod prince, Dewa Muda, goes in search of the golden deer, finds the golden deer, but is unable to capture her. In the clearing of the forest, he finds a lake. He goes to the lake and finds a beautiful flower. And this flower, a water lily of some kind, or a lotus, inscribed in the petals of this flower is a message from the princess in his dream, who tells him, if you want to meet me, you must fly up to the realm of Kayangan. Now, Kayangan is the celestial realm between the heavens and the earth, and with the abode of the princess. So Dewa Muda, because he has fallen so deeply in love with this princess of his dreams, embarks on a journey on a big kite, the Wabulan, an ancient kite, into Kayangan to meet his princess. Now, this is just one of the many stories of the Makyong, and really it is a homegrown fairy tale. It's one of the fairy tales, just as Cinderella or Snow White or some of the epic tales like the Ramayana. But somehow we're not familiar with these stories. And as Malaysians, or as people living in Malaysia, sometimes I wonder why we know stories from other parts of the world much better than our own. And this is one of the questions that I asked myself when I started work with PUSAKA. I started working with PUSAKA 15 years ago, and to be honest, I knew absolutely nothing about any of these traditions. I had studied literature, philosophy, history at New York University. That was my first degree. I had come back, and I thought I was worldly. And in some ways I was, in terms of having read many books, having been exposed to many different narratives. But to be honest, I didn't know that much about my own country. And the opportunity to work and to experience a completely different reality, but which was something of my own country, was a great opportunity for me and something I embraced. And so when I first was brought up to Kelantan, actually to Kuala Besut, which is on the border of Terengganu and Kelantan, to witness a Makyong performance, it was a life-changing experience for me. It was really something I had never. This is the Makyong at the back, Makyong dances. And these dances, they are not what we think of as professional dances, in terms of they've not been educated in a kind of, or trained professionally in an academy or anything like that. They are completely nurtured in their communities. And what they perform and the stories they tell and the traditions that they perform in their communities is not just a form of entertainment. There are elements of entertainment, but there are also elements of healing. There are elements of ritual, and it's really a total experience. And besides just the performers, almost the whole community gets involved, really, in a community performance. From making the stage, which is a big process because they have makeshift theaters that are constructed from bamboo and atap and wood, from the decorations to the costumes to the preparing of the feast. I mean, it really is a total experience in a community. It's not something I had experienced before. Even more so, what impressed me the first time I experienced a Makyong was also the conditions in which they lived. I mean, these communities that we work with, this particular community, they live in a very small fishing village in Kuala Besut. Most of them work in a keropok factory, little fish cracker factory, in which they earn very little money, hardly enough to sustain themselves. Many of them, the Makyong is a woman-centered tradition. It is a tradition in which the women play the main roles, in which the men play minor roles and musician roles, but really even the narratives, they go back to the sort of mythology of Kelantan and southern Thailand, Patani, which have very, very strong women leaders, women heroes, heroines, and so forth. And so this too was a kind of changing of my perception of what the rural Malay community was like. Sometimes from the outside, we tend to think, you know, that everything outside of KL is somehow slightly backward or somehow slightly conservative, which in some ways it is, but in other ways, there are worlds out there and communities and worldviews that are completely open and imaginative and alive that we actually are not familiar with. Now, this young lady actually behind me, Rohana Abdul Kader, she is the granddaughter of a very great, legendary Makyong actress, and Chet Ning. And Chet Ning, in the 1970s and 80s, she ran a Makyong troupe, which used to travel around Kelantan, around Terengganu, a kind of itinerant troupe. And she had this kind of charisma, incredible charisma, that her reputation just preceded her. Everywhere you go, people know the name of Chet Ning as the great Makyong actress. And of course now her persona and her aura has been passed down to her granddaughters, 3 of them, who are now taking on this tradition. And so we at PUSAKA, some of what we do is actually to try to support the passing down of this knowledge. It's not easy because there are many challenges that face these communities, not simply economic. I mean, there are also changing perceptions in society. Sometimes you do find that there are misunderstandings and misperceptions about the traditional arts, some of which sometimes they're seen to be incongruent with present-day reality. Some people think they're obsolete, but also some people think that they somehow don't fit into the right way of practicing culture. So all those are challenges. We try to do as much as we can to support them. Now, another one of the traditions that we work with is the wayang kulit, which wayang kulit, probably you know something of it. It is the shadow puppetry tradition, where characters are projected onto a screen with leather puppets. Now, the wayang kulit tradition as well, we work with a community in Kelantan, and they are the inheritors of a very great dalang, Tok Dalang Dola Baju Merah, which also there are many, many challenges in which they face in their community. There used to be hundreds of Tok Dalangs performing in Kelantan at one time. There are now just a handful, but we have tried to train the younger generation. Some of the boys that we work with, they've been trained by their fathers, by their uncles, and by the older men in their community. But they've now, from the age, they've started maybe when they were 5 or 8 to learn how to play the musical instruments, and they're now masters of those instruments. I mean, it's quite an amazing thing to experience. And the wayang itself, again, it's another world. If you see a wayang kulit, most of the time you know that there are shadows, the shadow play, that is, then they perform ancient epics, it's like the Ramayana. But one of the things that is conveyed, I think in a subtle way, is that the world is not black and white. So what you see in front of the screen is not necessarily what's happening at the back. And even all of the characters, what we think of as hero or villain or anti-hero, all those lines are somewhat blurred. So you can't always tell who is good, who is bad. I mean, there's the protagonist, but sometimes the hero is a flawed character. And there's a lot of complexity. And what is really conveyed, I think, in a community setting, they play out things like the narratives of power, the narratives of social interaction. All those things are played out in those ancient stories. And one element of traditional theatre that I think you experience across all these different traditions is that even sometimes our understanding of what is traditional is also called into question, because a huge element of what they do is actually improvisation. And sometimes we tend to think of the traditional as being in opposition to the contemporary or in opposition to the modern. So we think, this is modern theatre, this is traditional theatre, when in fact the lines are not that clear. And what I really experienced working with these people is that in these traditional masters, you only really are considered a master once you can improvise. And improvisation, as you know from jazz music, it is being in the moment. It is knowing how to respond to the moment, to your audience, to the people around you, to the situation, and to the mood of the space. And all these traditional performers are masters of that, of improvisation. That's something that was quite eye-opening. And none of them actually see themselves as being traditional or doing something old. They've inherited a certain tradition, yes, but they are recreating it at every stage in which they perform. And by retelling, by participating, it is a creative act at every step of the way, something that engages all the senses, something that engages the mind, the memory, and influences really the entire social interactions of the community. Yes, we can actually speed up the slides a little. Yes, thanks. The third community who I want to speak to you about is the Kuda community. And this is something, this is a tradition that you find mostly in Johor. It originated from Java. And there is a community in Johor. We work with a community in Parit Raja in Batu Pahat. Many of them are descendants of Javanese, and they've brought this tradition with them. And the Kuda Kepang is a trance dance tradition, mostly male, young males who are involved in this, but there are females as well. But the interesting thing about the Kuda Kepang community we work with, I find, is that all these young men are participating in this tradition, and this is also a tradition that has been sometimes discouraged by authorities and by certain elements in the community. But these young men are participating in this tradition with the consciousness that it is maybe preventing young people from getting involved in destructive behavior. For example, many of them gather in a parking lot at night, and they go and they play this Kuda Kepang for hours. They go into trance. It's a kind of ecstatic experience for them, and it releases a lot of energy. Now, if they weren't doing this, many of the boys in this community would probably be racing motorcycles. They would become matrempits. Many of them were, at some point in their life, a matrempit, racing motorcycles, killing themselves on the road, probably getting into drugs, and basically getting involved in social vices. And so these boys are really consciously using the Kuda Kepang to also transform their communities in a positive way, and to say, look, we are going to, rather than get involved in those social ills, we are going to nurture our tradition, we are going to somehow do something to safeguard our heritage, and also educate the community about how to how to not be destructive, to do something creative with their energy, but in a creative way, so that one thing I think they find when they perform, also for an urban audience, we bring them out to Kuala Lumpur quite a lot to perform so that they can engage with a new audience. I think for them, sometimes they feel that they have a new kind of sexiness, almost. Some of these boys, they've said to me, I feel very sexy doing this. It's something that's traditional, yes. It's something that's maybe old, something inherited from the grandfathers. But they feel a sense of attractiveness when they do this because it brings out their charisma, it brings out their personality, actually. Yes, this is the kuda kepang, if you can see behind. Many of these boys go into a trance, and what I call almost metaphorical shape-shifting. Obviously, they don't physically transform, but they metaphorically transform into their spirit animal, which is something like either a tiger or an eagle or a peacock. You can see some of them. This is a peacock trance at the back. And it's extremely beautiful. It's extremely beautiful, and it's something that we don't see really in the same way, with the same intensity in much of contemporary theatre in Kuala Lumpur. Now, for all of you, I think some of you are involved in things like drama, in music, for sure. What I think we can learn from engaging with these communities is that, one, they might be different, they might be somehow strange and unfamiliar, but I think if you find a chance to somehow engage and learn a little bit more about these traditions, you will find that there's a very deep connection and that you can communicate very well with them. You can learn from each other. They love to interact. So come and talk to me later, or come and follow our PUSAKA page. We have a lot of events sometimes that we bring out community masters of tradition to perform in Kuala Lumpur. Please do come. Many of our events are free for the public. Come and experience the beauty and the diversity of Malaysian traditions. And I urge you all also, this is a way of kind of rediscovering ourselves. It's rediscovering not just aspects of our community, but also aspects of the self, as all of them do in these traditional arts, commemorate and go back to something that is more essential. And I think that's something we can all learn in our creative lives. Thank you very much.